The morning mist clung to the banks of the Willowbend River like a secret not yet told. It was the kind of cold that stiffened joints and turned every breath into a ghost. 72-year-old Harold Blake shuffled toward the river's edge with a fishing pole in hand and the weight of 3 winters in his heart. Since his wife had passed, these quiet morning rituals weren't about catching fish. They were about keeping her memory alive in the places they once loved. But that morning, as he reached the bend near the cedar stump, something stirred beneath the low-hanging branches. It wasn't the splash of a trout or the rustle of a muskrat. It was a cry. High-pitched. Weak. Frantic. Harold's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer. And there, tangled in the roots where the river had worn away the bank, was a bear cub, small, shivering, and soaked through as if it had been in the water all night. Its eyes met his. Not wild. Not defiant. But terrified. Harold stood still, the fishing pole slack in his grip. The little bear's eyes never left his, round and glassy, rimmed with exhaustion. Its paws twitched in the mud, but it didn't try to run. It was too tired to. "Easy there, little one," Harold whispered, as if speaking to a child lost in a crowd. "I'm not here to hurt you." He set the pole down quietly and crouched, his knees protesting. The cub whimpered. The sound was heartbreak woven into fur, lonely, unsure, and pleading. Up close, Harold could see the creature was no older than a few months. Mud was caked into its thick fur, and a nasty gash ran along its hind leg, red and raw. The old man's breath hitched. Something, maybe a bobcat or a fall, had done that damage. Instinct pulled him back. You don't help wild animals. You call someone. You back away. That's what every pamphlet, every ranger, every voice of reason said. But reason didn't live alone in a quiet cabin with a room that still smelled like rose soap and old letters. Reason didn't dream about holding hands in the garden or listening to laughter bounce off kitchen walls. Compassion lived there now. Harold took off his thick flannel overshirt and, slowly, gently, wrapped it around the trembling cub. "You'll freeze out here," he muttered softly, unsure if he was talking to the bear or to himself. "Let's get you warm, little fella." The walk back to Harold's cabin was slow and uneven. He clutched the bundled cub to his chest like a frail secret, its tiny heart fluttering against his like a bird too tired to fly. Snow had started to fall again, quiet, feathery flakes that melted into the old man's beard. His cabin, tucked into the pines with a red-painted door and sagging porch swing, hadn't seen a guest in months. But today, Harold pushed it open with a purpose he hadn't felt since Ruth passed. He stepped inside, the warmth of the wood stove licking at his cheeks, and laid the bundle gently on the wool rug beside the fire. The bear cub let out a small, shuddering breath. Harold didn't have medical training. What he did have was a cupboard full of clean towels, a bottle of iodine, and a memory of how Ruth used to treat the farm dogs when they came home hurt. "You're just a baby, ain't you?" he murmured as he dampened a cloth and began wiping the dirt away. The cub flinched but didn't resist. It was too exhausted to care. It took time, nearly an hour, to clean the wound, swaddle the leg, and dry the fur. He set down a bowl of warm water and, not knowing what else to offer, a scrambled egg from his breakfast plate. To his surprise, the cub nosed at it, then devoured it hungrily. Harold leaned back into his old rocking chair and watched the cub curl into a fuzzy, snoring ball beside the fire. "Guess we'll figure this out together," he whispered. The wind howled outside, but for the first time in weeks, the cabin felt a little less empty. By morning, the bear cub had claimed the cabin as its own, or at least the patch of worn rug in front of the fire. Harold awoke in his rocking chair, a blanket half-draped over his lap, and blinked at the fuzzy form that snored quietly beside the stove. For a moment, he could have sworn it was one of the old hound dogs he and Ruth used to keep in the early years. But it wasn't. It was a wild creature. One who had no business being inside, no business sleeping so soundly by a man's fire. And yet, there it was. Harold stood slowly, his joints cracking. The cub stirred, lifting its head, eyes blinking sleep away. It made a small grunt, not frightened, just curious. "Well, you made it through the night," Harold said, voice hoarse with sleep. "That's something." He busied himself with breakfast, 2 scrambled eggs, a thick slice of sourdough toast, and a side of bacon. He split the eggs, placing half in a second dish. The cub gobbled it up without hesitation. When it was done, it sat on its haunches and stared at Harold. Not begging. Just waiting. "I can't just keep calling you, cub," Harold muttered. He looked out the frosted window. Snowflakes drifted down slowly, like feathers shaken loose from the sky. The spruce trees beyond were still and silent, the only movement the slow sway of heavy-laden branches. He looked back at the cub. "You're quiet," he said. "Gentle, too, for a bear. Reminds me of the way Ruth used to talk about winter hush." The cub tilted its head. "Maybe that's it," Harold nodded. "I'll call you Hush." The name settled between them like a feather on still water. The cub didn't protest. From that day forward, the silence of the cabin changed. It was no longer empty, it was filled with small things. The soft patter of bare paws on hardwood. The scratch of claws on the porch. The creak of Harold's rocking chair, matched by a low hum he didn't realize he'd begun to hum again. And every night, as snow blanketed the hills, Hush curled up by the fire, and Harold whispered a good night into the glow, as if Ruth might hear him through the veil of sleep and snowfall. The days rolled on in quiet rhythm. Hush grew stronger, his coat thickening with the richness of real food and warmth. Harold no longer startled at the sight of him moving around the cabin, it had become natural. Like a dog that didn't bark. Like a memory that had come to life. Most mornings, Harold would sit at the kitchen table with his chipped blue mug and read old newspapers, whatever the general store had left behind. The headlines were always stale, a week or 2 old, but he didn't care. It kept his mind sharp and gave him something to grumble about. Hush, meanwhile, had taken a liking to the porch. He'd sit out there for hours, staring at the woods, as if watching for something or someone. Occasionally, a deer would cross the clearing, or a hawk would circle overhead, and Hush would lift his head but never chase. He seemed content to just be. One morning, as Harold stirred his coffee, he heard the sound of tires crunching snow up the long drive. He stiffened. No one visited this far out unless they had a reason. He stepped outside, squinting into the pale sunlight. A forest green pickup truck came into view, newer than Harold's by a few decades, and parked near the woodpile. Out stepped a young man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a wildlife and land management logo stitched into his jacket. Harold's heart thudded. He instinctively glanced toward the porch. But Hush wasn't there. The young man approached, smiling in that polite but official way. "Mr. Fletcher?" Harold nodded slowly. "Eli Carter," the man said, extending a gloved hand. "I'm with the Regional Wildlife Office. Sorry to drop in unannounced. We got a report from a local hunter that there were bear tracks around your property, some unusual patterns." Figured I'd check in, just to be sure no trouble was brewin'. Harold didn't shake the offered hand. He nodded again, slower this time. I haven't had trouble, he said, voice calm. Plenty of deer come through, few elk now and again. Saw a fox last week. But no bears. Not in winter, not since the fires scared 'em off 2 years back. Eli shifted, squinting at the porch. Mind if I have a look around? We don't want folks surprised by hungry wildlife. Harold stepped aside, gesturing with a tilt of his head. Help yourself. As Eli walked around the side of the house, Harold's eyes scanned the treeline, then he saw it, the faintest twitch of a branch behind the woodpile. A shadow nestled deep, still as stone. Hush had hidden. Harold exhaled slowly. Eli returned a few minutes later. Didn't see much. You've kept your trash sealed up good, and there's no claw marks on the shed. Probably just a passing animal. Harold shrugged. Guess that's what it was. Eli gave him a half-smile. Well, if you see anything strange, anything too close, give us a ring, all right? Better safe than sorry. Harold nodded once. Appreciate you coming by. When the truck finally rolled back down the drive, Harold let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned toward the woodpile. You can come out now, hush. The branches rustled. A dark head peeked through, eyes wide and still. You're smarter than most folks I know, Harold said with a dry chuckle. You knew not to be seen. That night, as wind howled through the trees and fire cracked in the hearth, Harold sat beside Hush on the rug, his hand resting gently on the bear's shoulder. They can't know about you, he said softly. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Hush made no sound. But in the flickering light, Harold could have sworn he understood. It came overnight, as it often did in the mountains, thick, silent, and sudden. By morning, the world outside Harold's cabin was blanketed in white. The trees wore heavy coats of snow, the sky hung low with pregnant gray clouds, and the porch steps creaked under the weight of it. Harold stood at the front door in his flannel shirt and wool socks, cradling his coffee. Well, look at that, he muttered. First big one of the season. Behind him, the wooden floor groaned softly. Hush padded up to the doorway, eyes wide as he looked out. The bear's dark fur stood in sharp contrast to the bright white world beyond. He blinked at it, tilting his head like a puzzled child. Harold watched him for a moment, then chuckled. Never seen snow before, huh? Hush didn't answer, of course. But his paws moved tentatively forward. He stepped out onto the porch and sniffed at the cold air, steam curling from his nostrils. Then, slowly, he placed one paw in the snow. He lifted it immediately, shaking it off. Harold laughed, a raspy, full laugh he hadn't heard from himself in years. Yeah, it's cold. But you get used to it. Hush tried again. This time, he took 2 steps, then 4, and then, something shifted. A joy Harold hadn't expected unfolded in front of him. The bear began bounding, clumsily, playfully, through the snow. He rolled onto his back, legs kicking in the air, then flipped upright again and pounced at a falling snowflake like a puppy. It was the first time Harold had ever seen Hush behave like a cub. And it broke something in him. He set the coffee down, stepped out into the snow, and stood watching for a long time. The world was utterly quiet except for the sound of Hush's delighted grunts and the soft crunch of powder beneath his paws. For once, Harold didn't think about the officials who might come knocking again. He didn't think about how this couldn't last, or about the rules, or the world outside. He thought only of this moment. This beautiful, unexpected moment. Later that day, they built a path around the cabin together. Harold shoveled while Hush followed behind him like an enormous shadow. That night, curled in front of the fire, Harold spoke aloud without meaning to. "You should have had this from the beginning," he said softly, his hand resting on Hush's back. "A mother, a den, a safe place in the woods." Hush shifted slightly, letting out a soft huff. "But you got me," Harold said. "And I reckon I'm not the worst of the worst." Outside, the snow continued falling, the silence deepening. And in that small, flickering cabin, an old man and a young bear found warmth, not just in the fire, but in something far rarer. Belonging. It was mid-January when the stranger came. Harold spotted him from the window before Hush did, a figure trudging up the forest trail, his parka flecked with snow, a long walking stick in one hand, something slung over his back. His movements were slow, deliberate, not the aimless wandering of a lost hiker. This man had a purpose. Harold's stomach tightened. He put a hand on Hush's back, who was dozing by the fire. "Stay," Harold whispered, unsure if the bear understood the word, but the tone made him still. Hush looked up at him with questioning eyes but didn't move. Harold pulled on his coat, stepped outside, and shut the door behind him. The wind hit like ice. The stranger was closer now, tall, clean-shaven, eyes sharp beneath the brim of a snow-dusted cap. When he saw Harold, he raised a hand, not in greeting but caution. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, voice muffled by the scarf around his neck. "Just looking for someone named Harold Grant." Harold's heart slowed. "Who's asking?" The man stepped forward, slowly, his boots crunching in the snow. "My name's Dr. Marcus Rell. I work with Montana Wildlife Rescue." Harold said nothing. Just clenched his jaw. Dr. Rell continued, "I'm not here to take anything. I just want to talk." Harold didn't invite him in, but he didn't send him away either. They stood at the edge of the porch, breath visible in the cold, eyes locked. "You've got a bear," Dr. Rell said. "A cub. Maybe a year old by now." "I don't know what you're talking about," Harold replied quietly. Rell smiled, but it wasn't mocking. "We got trail cam photos 3 months ago. The cub's healthy. Living near a cabin that matches your location. And we heard from a feed store in town, someone buying large bags of apples and oats every week, same old man, always in flannel." Harold didn't blink. "So what now? You take him? Cage him? Euthanize him like they threatened last year?" "No," Rell said firmly. "That's not why I came." A long pause. "I came," Rell continued, "because I read everything your wife wrote. About the sanctuary you two were building. What it was meant to be." Harold's breath caught. Rell unslung the bag from his shoulder and held it out. Inside was a folder, weatherproof, thick. Harold hesitated, then took it. Inside were documents. Articles. Grants. A proposal for something called the Hush Project. "Your bear," Rell said, "isn't just a story anymore. He's proof. Of connection. Of what's possible when people care. And if you'll let me, I want to help." Harold stared at him. Then, for the first time in months, he felt it again, that fragile, glowing thread of hope. "Come inside," he said finally. Behind him, through the window, Hush's silhouette moved near the fire, watching. Waiting. And the future, once so distant, now felt just a little closer. The cabin felt warmer than usual that afternoon, not from the fire, but from the presence of something new. Possibility. Hush didn't growl when Dr. Rell entered. He didn't even retreat. He simply stood, watching from across the room with those deep, thoughtful eyes. The bear's head tilted slightly, as if he was trying to figure the man out. "Smart one," Rell murmured, his voice low and respectful. "Keeps his distance. Evaluates. Just like a wild bear should." Harold said nothing. He simply placed a cup of coffee on the table and opened the folder again. The proposal was real. It detailed a pilot program allowing a small number of human-raised or bonded bears to remain in protected, semi-wild enclosures, cared for but with limited contact, taught over time to become independent. It was based on research from cases in Scandinavia and Canada, bears that had been orphaned but raised with the hope of eventual rewilding. "He's a perfect candidate," Rell explained. "No aggression toward humans. Good physical development. And he's bonded, not dependent. That's rare." Harold ran his fingers over one photo, Hush nosing through snow for hidden treats. Another showed the bear standing tall, watching the forest. "He needs room," Harold said at last. "And routine. No strangers. No vans pulling up. He doesn't trust easily." "And neither do you," Rell said gently. Harold met his gaze, but there was no challenge in it. "Fair enough," Rell continued. "That's why this wouldn't be a handoff. You'd stay in charge. I'd come once a month. No press. No tourists. Just quiet help." "Why?" Harold asked. "Why him?" Rell looked toward the bear, who was now lying back down, his head on his front paws. "Because I used to believe wild meant alone," Rell said softly. "But that cub changed something in me when I read your story. I realized wild can mean connected too. Just differently." Silence fell again. Hush blinked slowly, then yawned, a soft, huffing sound that made Rell smile. "He trusts you," Rell said. "Maybe someday he'll trust me too. But for now, I'll follow your lead." Harold studied him. Then finally, quietly, he nodded. Over the following days, things began to shift. Harold and Rell walked the land together, measuring fence lines, testing soil for hibernation dens, mapping out a space that would feel like freedom, not captivity. Hush followed, at a distance at first, then closer, as though he sensed the future was being shaped in his name. Ellie returned on weekends to help, bringing bundles of fresh apples, old flannel blankets, and the same unwavering joy that had once filled the cabin. "I think he remembers me," she said as Hush took an apple from her outstretched hand one morning. "He does," Harold said, watching quietly. "He always did." At night, Harold sat by the fire, reviewing the grant paperwork, filled with terms like pilot sanctuary model and ethical cohabitation. But for him, it came down to one truth. The world hadn't forgotten his wife's dream. And Hush was the living proof of it. The first frost crept in overnight, feathering the grass with silver and making the wooden boards of the half-built enclosure groan with cold. But inside Harold's heart, something long frozen had begun to thaw. By sunrise, Harold and Rell were outside, lifting the final fencing panel into place. It wasn't a cage, it looked more like a natural glade wrapped gently in steel and cedar. Trees had been left untouched. A small pond shimmered at one end. Boulder clusters dotted the landscape. It felt like a secret corner of the forest, hidden but safe. "Feels like a beginning," Rell murmured, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. Harold didn't answer. He was looking at Hush, who stood near the cabin's porch, watching the open gate between the cabin clearing and the enclosure. It's up to him now, Harold said quietly. Rel nodded and took a respectful step back. Harold approached the bear slowly, as he always did. No leash. No command. Just trust. Hush watched him, ears flicking. The two of them stood side by side for a long time, gazing at the new space. And then, without fanfare, Hush moved. He walked past Harold, slow and steady, through the open gate. His great paws stepped over fallen pine needles. His nose twitched at the unfamiliar scents. When he reached the pond, he dipped a paw in, then both, splashing gently before pulling back and climbing onto a sun-warmed rock. He lay down with a deep, rumbling sigh. It was the sigh of something that had found peace. Harold didn't speak. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching. And for the first time since Marion had died, his heart didn't ache, it beat with quiet joy. Later that evening, Ellie returned, her boots crunching softly on the frost-hardened grass. "Is he really in there now?" she asked, peeking through the gate. "He moved himself," Harold said. "Didn't even look back." Ellie beamed and pressed her mittened hands against the fence. "He's starting his new life, Grandpa." "No," Harold said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We all are." The following weeks passed gently. Hush took to his new space like he had been born into it. He slept in the shelter Harold had built, but often chose the forest floor instead. He dug at tree roots, foraged in piles of leaves, and followed bird calls through the trees. And every evening, as twilight deepened, he returned to the fence just to sit. Not for food. Not for need. But for connection. Harold would sit in his rocker. Ellie would hum quietly beside him. And beyond the gate, Hush would rest, his eyes half closed, his ears twitching with every small sound, comforted by their presence. It was not ownership. It was not domestication. It was a friendship, grown wild and real. They had built a sanctuary. Not just for Hush, but for the ache in Harold's chest, for the memory of a woman who had once dreamed of something beautiful, and for a world that had forgotten how to hold its gentlest creatures close without taking away their freedom. And in the stillness of that shared twilight, one could almost believe that the forest itself approved. The snow came early that year, falling in thick, silent layers that blanketed the enclosure and turned the cabin into something out of a painting. Pines stood heavy with white. Smoke curled from the chimney. And somewhere within the trees, a golden bear stirred, carving out a den beneath the roots of a fallen spruce. Hush had begun to prepare for winter the way his instincts told him to, more distant, quieter, less interested in the humans who loved him. Harold understood. He recognized the change in the way Hush moved, in how he avoided eye contact, how his body grew heavier with the weight of hibernation. The bear was retreating, not in fear, but in rhythm. A rhythm older than Harold's years, older than the pines, older even than grief. "He's going to sleep soon," Ellie said softly one afternoon as she sat near the fence, bundled in her red coat and wool hat. "Yes," Harold replied. "And when he wakes, things will be different." Ellie frowned. "Different how?" Harold stared out at the trees. Hush had not come to the fence in 3 days. The last time he had, it had been a quiet visit. No apple treats. No long watching. Just a low rumble in his chest, a press of his snout to the snow, and then a turn, back to the trees. "I think," Harold said slowly, "that this will be his last winter here." Ellie's breath caught. "You mean he'll leave?" Harold nodded. "That was always the plan. We helped him remember what he is. And what he is, belongs out there." A long silence fell. Then Ellie whispered, "Will he remember us?" Harold's heart clenched. He thought of Marian's notebooks. The sketches. The dreams she had etched in soft pencil and careful script. She had always believed that animals remember love, not by face or place, but by how safe they once felt near you. "He will," Harold said. "Not like we do. But in his way, he'll carry it. Just like we will." That night, Harold added one final entry to Marian's old journal. First snowfall. Hush has settled into the far den. He's earned his sleep. Ellie left him one of her mittens near the gate. She said, "Just so he remembers what warm felt like." I think she meant more than just the weather. The days shortened. Snow deepened. On the morning of the first real freeze, Harold stood alone at the edge of the enclosure. No movement. No sound. Just the stillness of a creature entering a dream older than language. He raised his hand in a silent farewell. Not goodbye. Hush was not gone. He was simply becoming what he was always meant to be. And somewhere deep beneath the snow and pine roots, a golden bear slept, his breath slow and even, his dreams thick with scent, wind, and warmth. And maybe, just maybe, a cabin's light far away in the dark. Winter in Pine Hollow was always a hush of white and silence, but that year, the quiet felt heavier. Not empty, just still. As if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ellie still visited the enclosure every day. Even though there were no paw prints in the snow, and the gate remained undisturbed, she brought small things, a scarf she'd outgrown, a painted stone, an old photo of Hush and Harold that she tucked under a rock near the den's entrance. "I know you can't see them right now," she whispered one morning, brushing snow from the wooden fence, "but we're still here. Waiting." Inside the cabin, Harold kept the fire going and Marian's journals open. He read old entries and made new ones, reflecting on what they had done, what they had built. January 12th. 4 feet of snow. No sign of movement near the den. Ellie says it's like the world is dreaming along with him. I think she's right. They received a letter from the state's wildlife division in mid-January. A gentle check-in. A few questions about preparations for spring. No threats. Just a recognition of the quiet miracle that had taken place at the edge of the woods. "Looks like even the government knows how to whisper," Harold chuckled, handing the letter to Rel, who had returned for a winter visit. Rel grinned, sipping coffee by the fire. "You planning for when he wakes up?" Harold nodded. "We'll open the back gate. He'll have the choice." Rel studied him for a long moment. "And if he doesn't come back?" Harold smiled, not sadly. "Then we did it right." That night, Ellie sat by the window, watching snow fall in soft, slow spirals. Maggie, now older and gray-muzzled, lay at her feet. The wind pressed gently against the panes, and in it, Ellie imagined the sound of a heartbeat beneath the earth. Slow, steady. Hushes. "Grandpa," she said suddenly, "do you think animals have dreams like we do?" Harold looked up from his book. "I think they do." "What do you think Hush dreams about?" He paused. Then smiled softly. "Maybe a mitten by a fence. A little girl's laughter. A cabin full of light. And a forest that finally welcomed him home." Ellie leaned against him, her breath fogging the glass. "I hope he knows we're waiting." Harold wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I think he never forgot." And so, the days passed. Snow fell. Ice thickened on the creek. The pines bowed under the weight of winter. And deep in the earth, in a den woven of roots and straw, a golden bear slept soundly, held in the quiet arms of a forest that had become home. But spring, as it always does, was coming. And with it, something new. March arrived like a whispered promise. The snow, once thick and impenetrable, began to recede in patches. Icicles fell from the eaves with soft chimes, and the creek that had been frozen solid since December began to murmur beneath thin, glassy sheets. Ellie was the first to notice it. "Grandpa," she called from the yard, eyes wide, boots half sunk in slush. "There's movement near the den." Harold stepped onto the porch, shielding his eyes from the late morning sun. Sure enough, there, just beyond the tree line, was a narrow trail in the melting snow, a trail too large for any raccoon, too sure-footed for a wandering deer. A paw print. Fresh. Deep. Real. He said nothing, only nodded once, and Ellie's eyes lit up with something between joy and reverence. They didn't run toward it. Didn't shout. They just stood there quietly, like visitors at the door of a church, letting the forest speak first. That night, Harold made his first spring entry in Marion's journal. March 18th. He's awake. Still hidden, but we see signs. Tracks scraped bark. The den's entrance is widened. Ellie left a slice of apple near the gate. It was gone by morning. Over the next few days, the signs grew. The bees returned, tentative and sleepy. Buds pushed through the crusted snow, tiny and green. And Hush, though still unseen, made his presence known. The trail cam caught him at dawn once, standing beneath a tall pine, nose high, silhouetted by the pink edge of sky. He looked bigger. Stronger. Wilder. Then one morning, Ellie found the mitten. The same old wool one she had left by the gate before winter. It had been dragged, not chewed, not torn, just moved. Now it lay in front of the fence again, dusted in pine needles and faint golden fur. He brought it back, she whispered, cradling it in her hands like a treasure. He remembered. Harold stood beside her, his heart full and heavy in the best way. "He's telling us he's ready." Together, they walked to the back gate. Beyond it stretched the open path into the wider forest, unchained, unlocked, untouched since last fall. They opened it without ceremony. No speeches. No tears this time. Just space. Space for Hush to choose. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. He stepped out onto the porch, mug in hand, and listened. The forest was alive again, creaking branches, bird calls, the distant trickle of water returning to the earth. And then, a sound. Soft. Barely audible. But unmistakable. A low rumble. Not a warning. Not fear. It was the sound Hush used to make when he pressed his head against Harold's chest. A vibration that spoke of safety. Of memory. Of home. Harold didn't move. Didn't turn toward it. He just whispered, "Thank you." In the morning, there were no fresh paw prints. But the mitten was gone again. And Harold smiled. Because in the wild, the greatest love is letting go, and knowing the bond remains, stitched into the earth, written in pine needles, carried in the warm spring air. By early April, Pine Hollow was a patchwork of thawing mud, crocuses, and sunlight that lingered a little longer each evening. Birds returned in chattering flocks. Bees floated lazily between blooming snowdrops. The woods had awakened. And so had Hush. Ellie visited the enclosure daily now, not to leave food or call out, but to simply sit. She brought her sketchbook and drew quietly, as she always had. On one page, the den mouth, now empty. On another, a silhouette of Hush against the tree line, drawn from the trail cam stills Harold had printed for her. "He's nearby," she whispered one afternoon, flipping a page. "He's watching." Harold believed it too. The back gate remained open, its hinges oiled, the path clear. But it was never crossed again. Not by paw. Not that they could see. Until the morning it happened. It was a Sunday. The air smelled like damp earth and sweet bark. Ellie had gone ahead, skipping down the path, humming softly. Maggie padded behind her, tail wagging slowly. Then Ellie stopped. "Grandpa." Harold came around the bend and froze. Standing not 20 feet from the fence line, half in shadow and half in light, was Hush. Bigger now. Broader across the shoulders. His coat thick and clean, rich gold deepening at the haunches. He looked every bit a wild bear. But his eyes, those soft, deep, intelligent eyes, held something more. Recognition. Ellie didn't move. Didn't speak. She simply lowered herself to the ground, cross-legged, like she used to. Hush made no sound. But slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward, one heavy paw, then another, until he stood just at the edge of the open gate. Maggie barked once, low and unsure, then quieted. Hush looked down. And lowered his massive head toward Ellie. She lifted a hand, barely breathing. And for one brief, impossibly tender moment, his nose touched her fingers. No camera caught it. No witness but the birds and the breeze. But for Ellie, it was all she needed. "Hi," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. Hush chuffed softly, then turned. Not in fear. Not in haste. But with the calm, silent grace of something complete. He disappeared into the trees, the sunlight catching in his fur like fire. Harold came to her then, kneeling beside her. "You okay, kiddo?" Ellie nodded, smiling through her tears. "He came back to say goodbye." Harold put an arm around her. "No," he said gently, "he came back to say thank you." Later that day, Harold returned to Marion's journal. The page was already open. April 14th. He returned. On his own. Whole. Strong. Ellie touched his face. "I don't know what else to write." And perhaps nothing else needed to be. The story wasn't over. But this chapter, this long arc of rescue and raising and letting go, that part had reached its quiet, golden end. Spring deepened. The hillsides blushed with new leaves, and the air turned warm enough that Harold stopped lighting the wood stove at night. Life resumed its familiar rhythm, but something in the rhythm had changed. Not broken. Just softer. Like a song that had lost one refrain, only to discover another. Hush was gone, truly gone now. There were no more signs, no paw prints, no moved mittens, no distant shapes caught in the morning mist. It had been weeks since that final encounter at the gate. The enclosure stood open, unused, but still lovingly maintained. Ellie swept the path every few days, more out of ritual than necessity. She didn't cry anymore. But she did draw him, often. Her sketchbook filled with images, Hush leaping across a snowy log, Hush asleep beside Maggie, Hush at the gate, his nose just brushing her fingertips. "I don't want to forget," she said one evening, thumbing through the pages. "You won't," Harold promised, looking out toward the woods. "Some things stay in your bones." Maggie had changed too. No longer constantly alert, she now rested more often by the porch or followed Harold from the shed to the coop like a shadow. But every evening, just as the sun sank behind the pines, she would wander to the fence line and sit for a long, still moment, nose lifted toward the trees. listening, smelling, remembering, and always, always returning before the sky went dark. People in town still talked about the bear, the girl, the old man, the stray dog that raised a cub. Their story had spread farther than Pine Hollow, picked up by regional papers, shared on wildlife forums, and even referenced in a university lecture about cross-species bonding. But fame didn't touch the Carters much. They kept to their routines. Chopping wood, gathering eggs, watching stars. Until one morning, something arrived that interrupted the quiet. A small package. Hand-delivered. No return address, just a university crest and a neat label, to the Carters, Pine Hollow. Inside was a letter from Professor Adele Muir, a wildlife behavioral specialist at Colorado State. She had read their story, watched every video, studied Ellie's sketches posted online. And she had an offer. We are opening a new research and rehabilitation center focused on unconventional wildlife cases, orphans, interspecies adoptions, complex behavioral recoveries. Your experience is beyond valuable. We would be honored to name a special observation garden after your bear if you'd let us. The letter ended with a simple line that made Harold blink back tears. We believe Hush's story will inspire the next generation of wildlife caregivers. Will you help us tell it? Ellie looked at her grandfather, her eyes wide. Should we? Harold didn't hesitate. Yes. Because stories like Hush's weren't meant to fade into memory. They were meant to echo, like paw prints through pine needles, like warm breath on a child's fingers, like a bear's low rumble in the heart of a silent forest. The first time Ellie stepped onto the grounds of the new rehabilitation center, it was early fall. The trees surrounding the facility were just beginning to gild with amber, their leaves dancing in the wind like memories. A stone arch marked the entrance, and carved into it in delicate letters were the words, "The Hush Carter Garden of Kinship." She stood silently for a long time beneath that arch, hand in hand with her grandfather. Maggie sat beside them, tail sweeping slowly through the grass, sensing the sacredness of the moment. The garden wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. It was a quiet, enclosed space dotted with flowering shrubs, a small pond, a few carefully placed boulders, and a winding gravel path lined with wooden benches. Wind chimes tinkled faintly from the trees. In the center stood a bronze statue of a bear cub, small and gentle-looking, nuzzling the outstretched hand of a little girl. It wasn't perfectly lifelike. But it didn't have to be. It felt like Hush. Ellie touched the sculpture's nose and smiled through the tears that blurred her vision. Visitors came in small groups. Students, researchers, rangers, even schoolchildren. They walked the trail in reverent silence, learning from the plaques that told the story of a wild cub raised not in a lab or zoo, but in the home of a grieving old man, a strong-hearted girl, and a golden retriever with the gentlest soul. A wild cub who had learned love before he learned the forest. Ellie gave her first talk at the center that November. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she shared how they had found Hush, what it had taken to raise him, and what it had felt like to let him go. "I don't know where he is now," she finished, "but I know he's okay. And maybe someday, somewhere, he'll teach another wild thing that kindness isn't just for humans." Harold sat in the front row, tears shining in his eyes, his weathered hands clasped tight around Maggie's collar. He was proud of her. Not just of Ellie, but of the girl she had become because of Hush. That winter, they went back to Pine Hollow. Life returned to its quiet rhythm, firewood and hot cocoa, snowdrifts and stargazing. And though they never saw him again, sometimes, on still nights, they swore they heard something in the woods. Not close. But not far either. A low huff. The snap of branches. A shape, just at the edge of sight. Not a ghost. Not a goodbye. Just a presence. A reminder that somewhere deep in the wild, a bear named Hush walked strong and free, carrying with him all the love that had raised him. And in the warmth of a farmhouse tucked into the hills, a little girl, an old man, and a golden dog waited. Not for his return, but simply listening, with hearts wide open. Because once you've loved something wild, a part of you always listens for its footsteps.